both pre-service and in-service, our teaching experiences in K-12 schools, our professional and academic experiences, and within the educational literature. So as we became professors, we never really saw conversations around Asian American students, around Asian American educators, around Asian Americans in general, except for very token representation in perhaps language learning or other things, which are important things to study, but don't really get at the heart of a full Asian American experience. So based on our own experiences of invisibility, Jung and I had a conversation. We're like, we'd really like to develop, Jung had already done a pilot study, and we decided to do expand that out and do a national study of Asian American educators. So our central research questions in our study was, how do Asian American educators exist within systems designed to reinforce racist stereotypes that ignore, exclude, or suppress Asian American voices? How do they persist in reaching their academic and professional goals? And how do they resist in the face of pressures from multiple sources? So Jung's going to continue on talking a little bit about who Asian Americans are.
So one of the things that I think probably doesn't get discussed enough right now is there's a lot of discussion of anti-Asian hate, right? And so like the attacks that have been done. But I think what's not discussed often enough is how Asian Americans have been treated as if we don't experience racism and there's not a history of exclusion. And part of that is because people don't know a lot about Asian Americans. So we'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about the Teach Act and what that means specifically for Illinois. But we thought we'd give some background because a lot of people don't know a lot about Asian Americans. And so who are Asian Americans? They're the fastest growing racial and ethnic group. So the last 2020 census, we're at 7%. What's less known might be that 14% of undocumented immigrants are of Asian origin. So even the first dreamer is actually an Asian American student. I always talk about holding it down for Asian Americans in the Midwest because the majority of Asian Americans live on the West Coast. So it's a different experience. So even in Asian American studies, there's a phrase called East of California, referring to the experience of being Asian American outside of the second motherland, which is California. There's 6 origin groups that are the largest groups, although there are many other nationalities and ethnicities. So Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese make up 85% of all Asian Americans as of 2019. But there are lots of smaller groups that are left out of that, or that are part of that, but are often kind of not thought of. And around 57% of all Asian Americans are immigrants, and this is skewed much more towards adults. So 71% of Asian American adults were born outside of the United States, but you have a lot of kids that are coming up that are native-born Americans. So just a little bit about Asian immigration. There are entire books to this, but one small fact that a lot of people don't know is that the first Asians actually arrived on what is now the continental United States in the late 1400s, and part of that is they were enforced labor. They were like indentured servants essentially, or enforced labor on Spanish boats, and they jumped ship from the Philippines and swam ashore. But we don't get really large numbers of Asians immigrating to the US until the 19th and early 20th century, mostly male laborers. And so we have, if you're familiar with Asian American history at all, we see that through the railroad workers. We have indentured servants. And there's a really interesting Code Switch podcast about Guyanese and the whole presence of South Asians, so people originally from India who are now in Guyana. Post 1965 is when a lot of those quotas were lifted, or the very restrictive quotas. And so you have a lot of kind of the brain drain of certain Asian countries, where it's much more educated and more financially resourced Asians coming to the country. And then a second wave of refugees and also adoptees as a result of American incursions into Asia. So the Vietnamese War and the Korean War. And so there's a lot of Asian American scholars who will talk about, it's not so much that the East came West, right? So that Asians came to America, but it's also a product of the West going East. So American presence in Asia itself. Another thing that a lot of folks don't know is Asian American as a term didn't actually start out as a racial identifier. It actually emerged as a political identifying term in the 1960s and 70s. So really until the 60s or 70s, Asians as a group had not really come together. There were small moments where there were inter-ethnic solidarities, but because by the 60s, most of the Asians who lived in the United States were multi-generational Americans. They had a shared language, they had a shared history. They came together during the fight for ethnic studies at San Francisco State and the University of California, Berkeley. So Yuji Ichioka and Emma G were the ones who determined to use the new phrase of Asian American versus the older phrase Oriental. And so it's really about a politically unifying term, and it's not meant to be like, we are all Asians. Because if you look at Asians across the board, someone from India is going to look very different from someone from China versus someone from, like Kazakhstan. And so there's not a shared language and things like that. And so it's really meant to be a political term. Not that it doesn't get used as a racial term. So one of the things we talk a lot about in our work is that Asian Americans, so often people will talk about Asian Americans as being invisible, but then we would also argue that they're made invisible or there's an erasure that happens. And so even though we have a long history on this continent, we don't learn about that. Even the famous pictures of the railroad workers, right, during the Transcontinental Railroad building, Chinese laborers were not allowed to be in those pictures. So we don't have photo proof of that, right? There's a lot of race exclusionary laws. So at one point in this country, if you are a white woman that tried to marry an Asian man, you would actually lose your citizenship. So really extreme things. Obviously, we are aware of Japanese, more people are trying to embrace the word incarceration versus internment. So internment doesn't sound quite as horrible as what it was. And also erasing Asian American solidarity with others. So on one hand, we're made invisible. On the other hand, we're also made hyper visible. So this idea of always being a forever foreigner. So you can have been a third, fourth generation Asian American, but someone's always going to ask you, where are you from? And if you say Chicago, they're going to say, where are you really from? And even if you were born here and your parents were born here, they're still going to say, well, where are your ancestors from, right? There's always this notion of like, you are from elsewhere. And then the other part is this notion of that we're the model minority and that we are somehow, we don't deal with racism, that somehow we're there's this notion of white adjacency. We're often used as a racial wedge. So we're used to demonstrate to other minorities, look, like the Asians are doing it. They have a strong work ethic. They can fix themselves. Like, what's wrong with you guys? Without getting into all of the socioeconomic and institutional constructs that help lift up Asian Americans in some ways, but also oppress others. One thing we won't talk as much about, but there's a big push within Asian American communities to disaggregate data. And so you have East Asians who tend to come more educated and more resourced that are doing more successfully in school. And then you have other populations like Bhutanese and Nepalese who are coming as refugees, who are coming much more lower educated, or as products of war that didn't necessarily choose to be here, who are struggling much more on the margins. And so this notion of like all Asians are successful is really not accurate. And so that's a big part of that as well. So just a little bit about the model minority myth, if you're not familiar with it. This is the whole notion that Asian Americans are doing great. And what this actually came out was during 1966, so shortly after the end of World War II and the end of Japanese incarceration. People looked towards the Japanese Americans that had survived and said, look how well they're doing. They're assimilating so great. They're so successful, even though we took all these things from them. And that is the beginning of this notion that Asians are doing great. It also ignores the fact that the first large waves of immigrants that came after the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, it was a highly selective process. So it wasn't just any Asian could come, but you had to have certain job skill sets, certain education, certain economic resources. And so when we talk about, Asian Americans being very educated, it's because some of us came from parents that were also educated. So again, some of these differences. And so there's a lot of problems around this in terms of it masks racial issues. So I think one of the things with all of the anti-Asian hate that's been happening is that a lot of us have been dealing with racial issues for a long time, but a lot of our parents didn't tell us like, we should talk about it, we should advertise it. It was seen as kind of put your head down and work and somehow you'll make it ahead. And so we're starting to see more public discussion around this. I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. It also obscures some of the struggles that specific Asian groups face. So for example, like we talked about with refugees or people with disabilities, So there's a whole subset of educational research that looks at the underdiagnosis of Asian Americans for special education services. And so thinking about like, oh, you're a good, hardworking Asian, like you must know how to read, and you must know how to do math and science. And so this kind of overlooking of what that is. And so there's a lot going on in terms of how Asian American students are often not seen as individuals and what they're coming in with, and both their what their challenges are and their opportunities, but kind of this overarching myth of like, oh, you all work hard, you all are smart, et cetera. So these are just a series of media images around different stereotypes of Asian American men is what I have on the left-hand side, and Asian American women. And so Asian critical race theory draws on this notion of intersectionality, or all critical race theory draws on intersectionality. And so even though there are these broad arching Asian American stereotypes, there's also ones that are more specific to men and more specific to women. And we unfortunately, we saw with the result of the Atlanta shootings, like what that means for Asian women, right? So Asian women are seen as being submissive, as hypersexualized, right? So we see a lot of media images where Asian women are prostitutes, and that's also as a result of military incursions by American forces. And then if you are a strong Asian woman, then you're a dragon lady, right? So we see that. With men, we see Asian Americans being deviant. So there are multiple high-profile cases of Chinese American scientists who've been accused of espionage, and they're totally unfounded claims, whose careers have been destroyed. And so again, we have this example of even if you are Chinese American, you must still have ties back to the motherland or whatever that is. As for an invader, I was just texting with a friend of mine about Mickey Rooney, who is the horrible Japanese caricature in the middle there with the buck teeth and the sunglasses and the big glasses from Breakfast at Tiffany's. And then one big thing that always really irked me is, depending on your generation, if you read any of the Twilight books, the super nerdy character Eric in the book is not ever described as Asian, but when they made the movie, they decided, oh, it must be an Asian character. And so in a film that's mostly around like white main characters, he's the big dorky Asian nerd. Everyone's like, oh, of course, that's what Asian men are. They're nerdy.
And I just want to jump in for a second to say, it may be a little bit small on your screens, but if you look at the movie post that Jung put in the upper right-hand corner for Sayonara, just reading the text, we see the rendering invisible of the Asian American woman in the movie, right? This is Marlon Brando, big name, and an exquisite new Japanese star, right? So she's not even named in the movie poster. They live James A. Michener's story of defiant desire, right? So when we see this hypersexualization, we also see the erasure of Asian Americans as actually people, just as objects of sexual desire.
And then these are just some more examples of Asian American media. So there's a lot of discussion of yellowface. So you have white characters playing Asian American characters. So Emma Stone, which a lot of you might be familiar with, is supposed to be a biracial Asian American in the movie Descendants. And if you've seen her, she looks not Asian at all, because she's not. Scarlett Johansson, Ghost in the Machine, is supposed to play a Japanese detective. And so you have kind of this whitewashing that happens. The film 22 about the MIT students that do card counting, that was mostly Asian. So it's based on a true life or real story. Those were mostly Asian American students at MIT, and they pretty much made all the characters in the movie white. And so there's this notion that nobody wants to see Asian American stories. Now, thankfully, in the last maybe 5 years, we've seen an explosion of Asian American media, but it's not completely without complexities, right? So Aquafina has been criticized heavily for kind of cultural appropriation. So her taking on of Black language and kind of Black cultural identity markers without being Black, right? So there's a lot of discussion around the way she plays with her character. We also see more representation. So a lot of times when people think of Asian Americans, they tend to think only of East Asians, but we're seeing a lot more South Asian representation and Southeast Asian representation as well. And so this notion of representation in all of the ways actually matters. And then there's been an explosion even on Netflix. There's the whole Laura Jean series, which is the film in the shot in the top right corner. And so we're seeing more, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And so really, again, thinking about like how we portray Asian Americans, consume Asian Americans, who gets to be, who gets sold as such, and all of that.
So Jung kind of gave us an overview of Asian America and how it's evolved over the last couple of centuries. We wanted to talk now a little bit about the state of Asian America currently. And, in the last couple of years, especially in the last year with the rise of anti-Asian violence because of COVID-19, we've seen more attention paid towards Asian Americans. But as Jung mentioned, Asian Americans have been around for a long time and still have a lot of issues that aren't brought into popular media. But we did want to start with some of the statistics, the most updated statistics around the state of Asian America from the Stop AAPI Hate report, which is a report that was compiled by scholars looking at reports of anti-Asian violence. And so we've put a few statistics here on the slide. And I think it's still striking that even though there's been less media attention, I think when the pandemic first started, there was a lot of media attention on the attacks against elders and the deadly anti-Asian violence that was happening. But what we've seen is actually anti-Asian violence has increased, not decreased since 2020, but with less media attention. So 1 in 5 Asian Americans and 1 in 5 Pacific Islanders as well have experienced a hate incident in either 2020 or 2021. And 2/3 of these incidents involved harassment, such as verbal or written hate speech or inappropriate gestures, whereas 1 in 6 involved physical violence, which tend to get a little bit more attention. One of the things that's really striking about this as well is that 40% of these incidents took places in public spaces. So we're not talking about, violence that happens in private spaces where it's not out in the open, but on streets, sidewalks, roads, parks, hiking trails, or beaches, which I know Jung and I have had conversations. We are both runners, but I'm much less a runner since the pandemic happened because of fears of my own safety running in my own neighborhood. And that's also because one of the things that we think through are lenses of intersectionality, or the ways in which our identities overlap. And so 60% of the people reporting incidents of anti-Asian violence are female, right? And so it's not just attacks on Asian Americans, but Asian Americans by gender. And also Asian American Pacific Islander individuals who are female, non-binary, or LGBTQIA+ are experiencing hate incidents that target them, not just for being Asian American, but again, with these intersecting identities or layers of identities. So this figure shows the 20 states with the largest number of reported incidents of anti-Asian violence. And of course, you see California, as Jung mentioned, we are the state with the most the most Asian American population. So of the contiguous states, we are the states that also have the most reports of anti-Asian violence. But in Illinois, we see also a very fair number of reports, and it is one of the 20 states with the largest number of reported incidents. Where there's a higher concentration of Asian Americans in the states, we do see higher reports of anti-Asian violence, but it is something that is happening throughout the country on the West and East Coast, but also to some degree in the Midwest and South and Southeast. Again, where Asian American populations are. In Minnesota, there's a large Hmong population. In Texas, there's a large Vietnamese American population. A lot of refugee resettlement happened in Texas. So there are these pockets of Asian Americans that often go unseen, and where there are Asian Americans, there are also reports of anti-Asian violence. Since we're speaking to educators, we especially wanted to highlight anti-Asian hate and violence against Asian American youth. So after the first 18 weeks of the pandemic, starting with the lockdown in March of 2020, Stop AAPI Hate received 341 reports of anti-Asian discrimination involving youth nationally. And that made up 16% of the self-reported hate incidents to Stop AAPI Hate. Youth were more likely than adults to be harassed at school, public places, or public parks and online, with girls 2.5 times more likely to report hate incidents than boys. And then one of the things that we talk about in terms of erasure and invisibility is this idea of the monolithic Asian, that if you are Asian, you are by default Chinese, since most people associate Asian Americans with East Asians and with particularly Chinese folks. And since the COVID-19 anti-Asian rhetoric was often the China virus, in over half these cases, 56%, perpetrators employed anti-Chinese hate speech, including blaming China and the Chinese as source of the virus, which, again, when Jung was talking about historical precedents, right, we are often seen, or Asian Americans are often seen as diseased or dirty foreigners who bring in viruses. So these are just recycling of terms and of scapegoating that happens against Asian Americans. Adults were present in almost half of the incidents that were perpetrated against youth, but in only 10% of cases did bystanders intervene. And this is something that really struck a chord with us, because in our interviews with Asian American educators, many times they talked about how when they were young, in their first experiences of anti-Asian discrimination in schools, where children would pull back their eyes and the sides, or do a ching chong type of rhyme against them, when they reported it to their teachers said, oh, that's harmless. That's just what kids will do. And dismissed, right, these things that were very upsetting to students, instead of actually addressing it in front of their peers and actually addressing it as an act of racialized violence. And so when we saw these statistics, they were not surprising, but they were hurtful, because it's a reminder that a lot of times anti-Asian violence rhetoric, verbal harassment is not addressed in schools and in public.
And I think there's a lot to be said about the underreporting that happens, right? So how many kids are even going to go to do any sort of self-reporting? I mean, this is like, if you look at any like sexual assault data, right? It's a huge undercount. And so I think there's a lot of kids that are dealing with this every day in school and aren't necessarily going to report it. Don't think there's may not even be aware that there's a place that they can report it.
Yes, absolutely. And I think Jung brings up a really good point. I mean, a lot of times, even as children ourselves, we've talked about how, if we brought, discrimination up to our parents, we were told, just keep your head down, just keep quiet. It's okay. Like, just swallow it. We don't want to make a big scene. Right. And so this last figure just shows, even though we're focusing on youth and there's been a lot of media attention on elders, it's actually Asian American adults kind of in the center between 26 and 45 who are reporting the most incidents. And again, this could be because of underreporting on either ends, but also just shows that there's a wide range of across ages and across different racial groups and different social groups that are reporting these incidents of hate.
I'm going to talk a little bit about teaching Asian American history. So now you have a little bit of background on kind of the context of where we are now as a country, as well as a little bit of history around who Asian Americans are. So if you have heard, hopefully you have heard, the TEACH Act, which is Teaching Equitable Asian American Community History, was passed in 2021, and it's supposed to go into effect beginning in this fall of 2022. So what it says is, beginning with the 2022-23 school year, every public elementary school and high school shall include in its curriculum a unit of instruction, which is very vague, I know, studying the events of Asian American history, including the history of Asian Americans in Illinois and the Midwest, as well as the contributions of Asian Americans towards advancing civil rights from the 19th century onward. So Illinois was actually the first state, so this kind of blew my mind, but it was the first state in the country to mandate Asian American history curriculum. Because generally when we think of Asian Americans, the first state is usually not what we think of as Illinois, but the fact that we even have an Asian American senator is huge, right? So Tammy Duckworth is amazing. And there are states where other groups are pursuing similar legislation. So this notion that people looked to Illinois as a leader and they're like, oh, we want to do this. So there have been huge movements growing in New Jersey, Texas, Virginia, and Georgia. And so I'm actually going to be part of a panel that talks about kind of what this is looking like in all of these states, when how people are trying to advocate in different ways. So hats off to Illinois, but also now you need to start thinking about what your school is going to do with this in the fall. These are just kind of a whole bunch of facts that you can even think about, like, what are some things I could teach? So America's first race exclusionary immigration laws were against Asians. So again, the fact that Asians did not just arrive post 1965, but have been here for a while, and there was a lot of legislation around that. And it's interesting because there are some really large Supreme Court cases that involved Asian Americans that led the way to a lot of educational progress. And other things. So Bhagat Singh versus US actually established birthright citizenship. That was the result of a South Asian immigrant saying, because I was born in the United States, I should have citizenship, because there was no path to citizenship previously. And so that's like such a huge factor of being American, right? It's birthright citizenship. And so that's as a result of Asian Americans. Tape versus Hurley is the family, Mamie Tape's family fought for desegregation for Chinese Americans in California school. So that is, again, one of the precedent cases that led eventually to Brown v. Board. If you're also familiar with Sylvia Mendez versus Westminster is another one that looked at Mexican American students being segregated in California. And then Lau versus Nichols is the main case that established bilingual education in this country. And so there are some really, so again, when we think about like, oh, Asian Americans are relatively recent, these are all like early mid 20th century cases. And so there are things that were happening before 1965. There's a lot, obviously, about Japanese incarceration. I threw in two things that might be of interest. One is there's an amazing resource called The Orange Story. And it's a very short 10-15-minute video clip around a Japanese American man who's basically forced to sell his store at like rock bottom prices, when this was a huge issue for a lot of Japanese Americans at the time. But then what they did was they built an entire website filled with a lot of primary source documents. And I would say you can scale it down for younger kids or scale it all the way up for high school students. It's just amazing. There's like radio clips, there's pictures. I mean, so check it out. If you haven't taught incarceration before, that's a great place to start. And then there's so many books, like young adult fiction and nonfiction books that also address that. I was also telling Bettina about this, which is also really interesting. I highlighted the red ones, but I got really excited about the other ones too. So one of the things is we talk about deportation a lot, right? And so one of the things that people may not know is Cambodian Americans have also been forcibly repatriated back to Cambodia, regardless of whether they can speak the language or they have any family ties. When I first watched this movie a long time ago called Sentenced Home, it's about the forced repatriation of Cambodians. They arrived in the United States as refugees. They were never told that they should really work on getting their citizenship because they were here legally, and they didn't realize that there was power in the citizenship. And as a side note, when I was in high school and very apolitical, because I had Korean citizenship at the time and I need to get naturalized, I was like, I don't know if I ever want to vote. Like, do I really need to get naturalized? It seems like, and then I watched this movie, and even if you're here legally, you can be deported if you commit a felony. And so what's happening in Cambodia, but other countries like Guatemala, is you have a whole bunch of people who have no job skills, who have no family ties, who may not be able to speak the language, being told this is your country now because they got caught up in different things. So there's a very short, very beautiful spoken word piece by Anita Ali, who's a Cambodian American activist and artist. And I think she's also a professor, who did a really beautiful piece about My Asian America. And it's with all these Cambodian Americans that have been repatriated and kind of their struggles to think about being American and also Cambodian. And then one quick Illinois specific history bit is that 20,000 Japanese Americans were relocated from the camps to Chicago. So Chicago has kind of these weird pockets of Japanese Americans. And I was always like, why are they coming to Chicago? And it's because when Japanese Americans were kind of released from the camps, they weren't allowed to stay on the coast. So a lot of them came to Chicago. And that's why if you've ever shopped at Mitsuwa and you're like, why is this random Japanese store here? That's part of the history of why. So these are just some resources to consider when planning. So as you're kind of thinking ahead and thinking about like, what are some things to do? One of the things that you may hear is this term AAPI, so Asian American Pacific Islander. It's kind of a contested term, so you want to think about if you're going to use that or not. And part of that is Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders have a very different history, and some of their issues are very different from when we think about East Asian or even South Asian Americans. And they feel like they often get obscured when they're kind of in the larger Asian American umbrella. But they also don't like how they're included almost as a token by this AAPI term, but their needs and their needs and concerns aren't ever really addressed. And so there's been some pushback from the Pacific Islander community to not use the term AAPI. It continues to be used in different ways, but it's something to think about, that if you are going to use AAPI, are you actually trying to include Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander voices? Don't just do like East Asians, right? Or South Asians. So being really purposeful and mindful about whether you want to use AAPI or not and what that means. There's a lot of resources on the Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Chicago website, which has a lot of resources for doing teach. And part of it is this notion of, am I going to teach a specific unit for Asian American history, or am I going to sprinkle it in? And they actually have frameworks and resources for both. And so if you're talking about so if you could, there's a lot of critique about just confining ethnic history to one heritage month, but oftentimes Asian Americans don't even get that. So sometimes that might be a place to start. Or they also have resources where you can talk about like Western expansion and colonialism, and also include Asian Americans that were part of that. So that's, again, thinking about like, are you doing a full unit, kind of a standalone unit, or are you kind of incorporating Asian American history throughout the whole year? There's also a new Asian American Studies curriculum framework that's been developed by two colleagues of ours, Soyan An, who's at Kennesaw State, and Noreen Nassim Rodriguez, who's at Colorado State. And so if you're thinking about like not just the actual kind of meat and potatoes of what Asian American history looks like in your classroom, but really thinking about conceptually, what does Asian American studies look like? They have a really amazing curriculum framework they just released this summer. And then thinking about, is there a way for me to include actual Asian Americans into my teaching? Where are their connections? So whether it's about local history, whether it's about if you have populations that are in your community that you can also have access to. So one of the things that people have talked a lot about is that so Erica Lee, who's a very well-known and established Asian American historian, has talked about when she first, so she's from California, if I remember correctly. And so she learned about Asian American history in the context of California. And she, up until very recently, was at the University of Minnesota, which has a very different Asian American historical context. So when she's talking about Chinese and Japanese, that's not what Minnesota is. Minnesota is mostly Hmong, and it's mostly refugee. And so she realized when she talked about Asian Americans, she had to kind of flip the context of what she was talking about and who she was talking to. And so again, thinking about what is the local connections, what makes sense, things like that. And then finally, what resources do I have or need to procure? I know everybody's kind of budget tightening in some ways. And so thinking about, are there things online? Are there professional developments? Are there, people in the community that they're willing to come and speak or even work collaboratively with you? And so really kind of considering what are all the resources you have at your disposal. And so these are just some do's and don'ts I came up with. And so I have kind of think about local context and community. So thinking about the EOCs, the East of California. In Illinois, we don't really have a large Hmong population, but I know out in Elgin, there's a large Lao population. I know in Wheaton, we have a Burmese refugee population. So really thinking about who is in your kind of community or vicinity. Partner with family and community members. And so thinking about ways to bring a lot of times Asian American families are seen as like, they're not involved, right? My parents did, they worked 12-hour days, so they weren't able to come to a lot of things, but that doesn't mean they weren't supporting me at home. So are there innovative ways you can involve Asian American families? Working collaboratively and interdisciplinarily with other educators, looking at intersectionality. So thinking about, are there opportunities around gender, sexuality, whatever, socioeconomics, whatever it might be. Understanding the importance of words and language. So again, there are attempts to kind of change the ways that we conceptualize things. So you may have heard of the LA riots. There's been a desire to start rephrasing that as an uprising. So moving away from kind of like the looting and pillaging notion of rioting versus uprising involves more of a political context. again, thinking about Japanese internment, internment doesn't sound so bad, but incarceration does, right? So again, moving away from kind of the neutralization of words to really get into what things really mean. And so just to actually one quick story, I'll say, and I tweeted about this recently, and I've had a lot of conversations. I was at an educational conference this past weekend, and Celeste Ng, if you're familiar with her books at all, was one of the keynote speakers. And there was a Q&A afterwards. And one of the teachers was asking about a specific essay that involved an Asian slur in the title. And I'll be honest, I wasn't 100% paying attention. So I kind of missed this Q&A section. But I had a friend come up to me later in the conference and say she was really offended because this teacher kept using this Asian slur over and over and referencing the work and using that word over and over, and it was very, very harmful for her. And I think there's this notion, like I can't imagine a space where an educator would get up and use the N word repeatedly and ask like a Black person, like, have you read this piece? Like, and not think about the context and the harm that word could be caused. But again, I think a lot of times Asian Americans, like, it's just, there's not as much awareness. And so that was part of my reason for wanting to tweet some of this, was to bring awareness around, like, there are Asian slurs. I've had them, like, again, quick sidebar, but when I was, after my freshman year of high school, I went to high school in Northbrook, which some of you may be familiar, it's the North Shore of Chicago. And I was chased by a group of boys with 2 other Asian American girlfriends of mine, and they said racial slurs at us. They threw rocks at us. And Northbrook is a nice suburb, right? And I think about, like, I never reported that because it never occurred to me that, like, I could do something or that anybody would do anything with that. I mean, hopefully, if that happened today, there's a lot more resources available. But I have a history with that word that's triggered when people use that, even if it's not in a specifically derogatory way. So again, thinking about the importance of language. The other thing, I have some don'ts. One is, don't assume that just because someone's Asian, they know Asian American history. So we're friends with a lot of, like, we have a really good friend of ours who's an adoptee scholar, and she talks about this a lot. This is a huge issue for Asian American adoptees. Like, oh, where are you from? Who are your parents? Can you speak Chinese? Like, all of these things. But Tina and I have also written and talked a lot about trying to reclaim our heritage languages because we're not very fluent in them. And so this expectation, again, that you must speak the language. Don't focus only on East Asian American history. So again, don't say all Asians are just East Asian. Don't conflate Asian and Asian American history. So this is like the silliest pet peeve, but if any of you are Peloton riders, during, they'll do the Heritage Months, and there was a Heritage Month where they're doing during AAPI Heritage Month, they were doing Asian American history rides. The entire playlist was K-pop, like bands from Korea. And I was like, that is not Asian American, my friends, that is Asian, right? Or they did a Bollywood one. So again, like, how are we saying we're celebrating Asian American history and pride when it's all Asian? So again, differentiating between Asia and Asian American. Don't forget contemporary Asian American moments. We hear this all the time when we're talking about diversity. Don't focus just on trauma, right? Make sure that you're also celebrating, like, the joy. Nobody wants to talk only about racism of being Asian. There's also a lot of good things about being Asian. Don't think that pronouncing, oh, I have a typo there, of course. Don't think that pronouncing things correctly is not important. So Jung is not that hard a name, I think. But, like, I cannot tell you how often routinely my name is butchered and people will not correct themselves. Or people will say, well, I can't say it, so you say it for me, right? So it's like, so even when I was doing the land acknowledgement, I Googled, like, how do I pronounce some of these tribes? Because I'm not familiar with that, right? So take the time to do that, because names are really important. And don't call things, and I just saw this on Twitter about supposedly Chinese people eating cats. Don't call things like food weird or exotic. So again, making things the other, and because nobody wants to think like what they eat is not normal, or that, that they should feel ashamed of what they're eating or what they're doing at home. So that's by no means an all-encompassing list, but those are some things to think about. Is this you or me, Bettina?
I think these were just a list of resources that kind of go along with teaching Asian American history that Jung had compiled. So we actually have a bunch of resources at the end of our presentation. And so these are specifically ones that are focused on Asian American histories, including one of our giveaway books, From a Whisper to a Rallying Cry, by our friend and former journalist, Paula Yu,
So I
on
will
the
say
killing.
that The Making
Okay.
of Asian America is a very large, thick, very well written, but also a dense book on Asian American history by Erica Lee, who was at Minnesota, but is about to start as a professor at Harvard. She actually is working with Christina Sonternvat. So if any of you have read A Wish in the Dark or The Last Mapmaker, my son just finished reading that. She's a really well-known Thai American writer, or children's and young adult writer. And so she's actually going to be working with Erica to do a young adult adaptation. I don't know when that's coming out, but kind of keep your eye open. Christina's actually also working on a picture book bio of Tammy Duckworth, which is super exciting. And then the book that is going to be one of the giveaways is by Paula Yu. This is actually a really fantastic book, and if you're especially if you're middle school or high school, this would be a really great book to start with. It's looking specifically at the killing of Vincent Chin, who was a Chinese American man in the Detroit area, and he was killed in the 80s by two white men who mistook him, is that the word? Mistook him as Japanese. And it was at the height of the anti-Japanese movement or sentiment because of the auto industry. And one of the most kind of horrifying pieces of that was during the trial and sentencing, the judge actually said, you fit the punishment to the person, not the crime. And so the two people who killed him were basically let off with like a very small fine and no jail time, or almost no jail time. And so Paula Yu, who's a journalist, does a really amazing job documenting kind of who Vincent Chin was, as well as how the trial unfolds. It's just outstanding. It really is compelling as a piece of writing in and of itself, but also gets into a lot of like Black and Asian solidarity. The movement, it's kind of seen as one of the first Asian American movements, kind of national movements that galvanized at the time. And so if you're looking for kind of a jumping off point for one piece, that's a really big one.
Thanks, Jung. So Jung was talking about teaching Asian American histories, and in Jian's introduction, she mentioned a lot of my work, in addition to being on Asian American educators, is also around humanization. And one of the ways that we push back against Asian invisibility and just this monolithic portrayal of Asians can be through narrative plenitude or through telling more Asian American stories. So you may be familiar with the work of Rudine Sims Bishop, who talks about kind of mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. And I like to start with this quote: when there are enough books available that can act as both mirrors and windows for all our children, they will see that we can celebrate both our differences and similarities, because together they are what makes us all human. And I know that earlier today, for those of you that were in the morning session, there was, conversations around the discourse around critical race theory. And, there's all of this fight right now against diverse texts, but diverse texts are so important in bringing forth stories and narratives that show our shared humanity. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about some texts and offer some ideas for texts that can give more diversity to the Asian American experience. And so we also wanted to start with what actually exists. And this is a little bit outdated at this point, but this was compiled in 2018 by a colleague and friend of ours, Dr. Sarah Park Dolan, and illustrated by David Shook. And this just shows representation in children's books, right? So when we look at the CCBC inventory of children's books, we see that 50% of children's books that are being published are still involve white characters. And then animals, right? Animal characters actually are 27% of children's books, right? So they're centered around animals. So when we total the number of African American, Asian Pacific Islander, Asian Pacific American, Latinx, and Indigenous folks together, right, we don't have as many protagonists and positive representations or characters from diverse backgrounds as we do animals in children's literature, right? And so we really want to think about where children are seeing themselves. And here, this just talks about characters from diverse backgrounds. And it doesn't actually even get to the ways in which these characters are represented or who is telling their stories, but just in representation alone, and it doesn't disaggregate, again, Asian Pacific American from Asian Pacific Islander, right? But just in this representation alone, we see a real underrepresentation of children of color and characters of color within children's books. And that kind of leads to the idea that Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is a Vietnamese American author, talks about in terms of narrative scarcity versus narrative plenitude. And so what he says is narrative scarcity means very few of the stories out there are about you, whoever you happen to be, whatever kind of minority you happen to be coming from. Narrative plenitude is when almost all the stories are about you. And when most of the stories are not about you or not about us, then when one story comes out that is about you, enormous weight is put on that. And he was talking about this in response to, there was a very large boom of people were very excited about Crazy Rich Asians when it came out. And Crazy Rich Asians is a very subsection of very elite Asians and Asian Americans, right? Which is very non-representative of most folks who are Asian American in the US. But then after Crazy Rich Asians, there was this reality show that also focused on very, very rich Asians, right? And then the shots of Sunset, which focused on, rich South Asians. And so, we're looking at rich East Asians, rich South Asians, and, most Asian Americans, are either middle class or are working class, right? Many Asian Americans who come over as refugees, and even in Crazy Rich Asians, there was discussion about how only certain Asians were portrayed, right? And not the working class Singaporean folks who actually support the economy, right? You only saw one side within that. But what happens is when there are so few stories, right? All the weight comes onto those stories. So Jung and I have talked about how when Asian American literature is taught in secondary schools, it's usually either the Joy Luck Club or Woman Warrior, which are both Chinese American stories, right? And were written, and no disrespect to Amy Tan or Maxine Hong Kingston, but were written, now 50 years ago, right? And so it's not really speaking to a diversity. And again, it's making all Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, and even more telling is that sometimes Asian American representation is represented by Pearl Buck's The Good Earth, which is written by a white missionary woman, right? But seen as Asian American literature, right? And it's written about a Chinese experience, right? And so I think one of the things that we have to think about is, where is representation? What does it look like? And how can we include more representation? And so we wanted to provide a few resources, because one of the things that we've seen in our work in teacher education and working with teachers is they're really excited about trying to incorporate more Asian American voices, but they actually don't even know where to start. And so one of the ways that we think we can encourage narrative plenitude is through text sets. And text sets are a collection of texts tightly focused on a specific topic. So they may include various genres such as fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and so forth, and media such as blogs, maps, photographs, art, primary source documents, and audio recordings. And that quote was taken from the Fordham Institute's discussion of text sets. And so you'll see on the slide pictures of various texts that could be incorporated into text sets that are representative of more than just one Asian American or Asian experience. The Next American Revolution is a nonfiction text talking about activism that was written by Grace Lee Boggs, who was a prominent Midwestern Asian American activist who worked in solidarity with the Black American community in Detroit, right? Any Day with You is a Filipino American young middle grade book written by Mary Respicio. A Map into the World, which is our other giveaway book by Kao Kalia Yang, is about a Hmong family and their relationship with their across the way neighbors, and how that helped them to kind of adjust into their community and form community. And then we have art as representation and graphic novels. The picture in the bottom right corner is from Thi Bui's The Best We Could Do. And so these types of stories tell different Asian American stories and begin to unpack the complexity of Asian American experiences. And so, as noted, right, text sets can promote narrative plenitude and a more nuanced perspective through enriching and expanding our understandings of various Asian American experiences. So instead of thinking that all Asian American experiences are one, and I mean, we can actually begin to uncover that there are many, many different Asian American experiences, and some of which are not included in even these texts. So we can also use text and text sets to challenge the model minority stereotype. So Jung talked about the model minority as, you know, one of the predominant stereotypes that are that Asian Americans are conceptualized through. And so I've put together this slide, and that has a series of kind of different types of text that could be used across K-12. So in nonfiction, you'll see the text that I mentioned, The Next American Revolution, and then the text that Jung spoke about earlier, From a Whisper to a Rallying Cry, right? And so both of these texts challenge the idea of submissiveness, the idea that Asian Americans aren't sociopolitically active, the idea that Asian Americans are just one monolith. And then picture books, we've included A Map into the World by Kaukalia Yang, and then Watercress by Andrea Wang. And Watercress is a book that is about a Chinese American immigrant family's experiences in Ohio, right? And the main character is really struggling with, she doesn't want to be different than her peers, but her parents have her collect watercress by the side of the road and she doesn't want to eat it. But then her parents tell her about their stories in China growing up, and she recognizes kind of their experience, and then it helps her to better understand her own experience and navigate that. I've also included a couple of graphic novels, The Best We Could Do, that I mentioned earlier by Thi Bui, which is an autobiographical memoir of her experience and also her parents' experiences immigrating from Vietnam. I Was Their American Dream, which is lighthearted, but also gets at really interesting kind of daughter of immigrant experiences from Malaka Gharib, who is Egyptian and Filipina American, and then The Magic Fish by Chung Ling Nguyen, which talks about both the ways that he helps his mother to kind of understand his experience, but also his experiences in coming out as a gay Asian American person. And then I wanted to also highlight some nonfiction texts. So the picture show where Asian American teens and centering Asian American teen voices navigate being themselves as their communities are targeted. So speaking specifically about how Asian American teens talked about their experiences after COVID-19 and their experiences of racialized violence. And then this article by Gary Duong, You're Called a Model Minority Until They Decide You Aren't, which was an NPR article piece about his kind of coming to racialized awareness. And then because Jung mentioned, right, this idea of, do we include Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians within this AAPI moniker, I also wanted to introduce a text set because I've actually really been committed to trying to uplift more Pacifica or Pacific Islander voices and understanding the specific issues that face a lot of Pacific Islanders. And so you can also think about integrating text sets around colonialism, loss, climate impact, and sovereignty, which are still issues for many Pacifica people today. And so some resources, right? There are poets that have written about a lot of these: Kathy Gentile Kijitner, Clarissa Mendiola, Craig Santos Perez. They talk about a lot of the impacts of climate change, right, which is very important for a lot of the Pacific Islands. And then articles about sovereignty. The fight for Mauna Kea is a fight against colonial science. We need support. Pacific Islands seek help and unity to fight climate change. And then work by activists. So Haunani K. Trask, who is a Native Hawaiian scholar who passed away in the last couple of years, wrote a text from a Native daughter, which is a memoir text, but really talking about the Native Hawaiian perspective, which often gets erased because a lot of Asian Americans have gone over to Hawaii and it's seen as kind of an Asian American haven, but it ignores, right, the histories of colonialism and Native Hawaiian perspectives. And so this is a way to kind of bring in Pacifica voices into the curriculum. And And then we just had some final thoughts. I wrote an article for ASCD on countering Asian American invisibility, and we've slashed that, and we talk about erasure, right? Invisibility seems like it's something that's natural, that just happens. We're just invisible, but actually the blatant erasure in schools. And so just to go over a couple of points from that article, and again, these are like Jung's do's and don'ts. I think it's really important to avoid making assumptions about Asian American colleagues and students. She talked about this in the don'ts, right? I think when people come to meet me, they assume that I'm foreign. They assume that I don't speak English the way that I do, right? That I'll speak with a particular Asian accent, that I may not know things about America, even though I'm American. I was born in the United States. And so I think there are a lot of assumptions. And again, like that Asian Americans also know their heritage language or know their histories, which we haven't had access to, right? Because of this erasure and invisibility. The other thing that I talk about is proactively listening to what your colleagues and students need. So we have had experiences of some of our colleagues and friends who have come to a seminar like ours, and we hope that this seminar empowers you, this keynote empowers you, and that you're able to have these resources. But also that doesn't mitigate, right, the actual lived experiences and needs of your colleagues and students, which may not be found in these books. So we have a colleague who is a Filipino immigrant to Hawaii, who was like, oh yeah, I had a colleague who ended up telling me like that wasn't my experience because they knew about the Asian American experience. And this was a non-Asian American person who was saying, no, that can't be what you need, because actually I just learned about this, and this is actually the Asian American experience. So again, it's important to learn about the diversity of the Asian American experiences, which hopefully our resources will help to do. And then it's important to integrate multiple Asian American perspectives into your curriculum. And as Jung said, whether that's in Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, whether it's throughout your curriculum, whether that's through a unit. I mean, right now there's such narrative scarcity that often Asian Americans never see themselves authentically represented in the curriculum. So just thinking about what are next steps that you can take to incorporate multiple Asian American perspectives into your curriculum. And so we've provided actually a ton of, and we want to leave time for Q&A, so we won't go over these, but we are going to share our slides with you. And so all of these are linked and they are all in the resources. But these are some of the resources that Jung has compiled, that we've both compiled around Asian American histories. And then these are additional resources. So where to look around Asian American and diverse literature. And it's really interesting. So Aotearoa Books, which is a Pacifica children's book site. Aotearoa is actually the Maori word for New Zealand. And I just saw today on Twitter that there's actually discussion about renaming New Zealand by the Maori name. So it's very interesting. Pacifica books are actually very hard to find in the US, but they are more common abroad. And then we put together a bunch of additional titles for Asian American picture books. And then I'm just going to leave this on for a second, but these are books that we have. My youngest kid is a little bit younger than Jung's youngest, but we've done a lot of buying of these books for our children's bookshelves. So these are Asian American picture books, and picture books can be used all across elementary school and even up into middle and high school. They're fun to read. And then early reader and middle grades books. We have some series, we have some middle grade titles. Jung mentioned Christina Tornvat, who's working on the young adult version of The Making of Asian American History. Her book, A Wish in the Dark, is here, among others. And then these are additional young adult and graphic novels. Again, previewing a wide array of Asian Americans throughout. So we have a link here. We also have a PDF version of our slides we welcome you to use all of the resources. Just to please be sure to cite us. And then we also created an actual Asian American playlist, different than just K-pop. My son actually listens to all K-pop all the time, so that's what I listen to. But we've created a playlist of actual Asian American artists in case you want to incorporate more Asian American artists into your work. And so that's what we have for you today. And I'm going to stop sharing so that we can actually engage in some conversation with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bettina and Jung. I don't know where to begin. So let's just begin with questions that folks have. I think you'll see some thank yous in here, but I believe we had a question early on. And Jung, I think you may have responded to it. I think it was about the relationship between the right wing's growing verbal attacks on intellectuals or elites and physical violence that Asians are experiencing. Do you see a relationship there?
There's actually two things. There were two thoughts I had when Max asked that. One is this. I hadn't thought about that, and it wasn't a connection I'd made before. But I think a lot of it is more about like xenophobia and like we've been in a state of nationalism that's been very complicated for the last several years, and so I think it's a lot of like, go back to your own country and you don't belong here. And you're looking for a scapegoat for whatever you're going through. But it's interesting because one of the other things I was thinking about, and it has less to do with anti-Asian violence, but is interesting in terms of thinking of intellectuals, is there are multiple movements, both in higher education and in K-12, where Asian Americans are being weaponized to become activists and supporting and in refuting and not supporting affirmative action, right? And then in New York City in particular, if any of you listen to the Code Switch podcast, there was a 7-part series that was kind of a sub-component of the School Colors podcast. And there's a lot of Asian Americans in the specific neighborhood of Queens that are trying to keep selective enrollment to their school. And it's really specifically pitching them against the mostly Black and Brown community members that are trying to advocate for making things less selective enrollment. We've also been seeing this in San Francisco. And so again, we're seeing this pitting of Asian Americans against other minoritized groups, and it's really not to anyone's benefit. But I think this is also where it gets complicated, because a lot of Asian immigrants don't know that there's this long history of activism and this notion of like working in solidarity with other groups. Bettina, I don't know if you were about to jump in.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Jung is exactly right. And I think, again, it has to do with our positioning as Asian Americans, right, against. So a lot of people think that Asian Americans are the safe minority group, that we are white proximal, and that is used, again, it's all part of this kind of model minority-ness, right? And so I don't know that there's necessarily that connection, except that you're safe until you're not, right? There's this whole idea of you're the model minority until you're not. And so, I think the right wing likes to align with Asians and likes to use what we call racial mascotting, right? So use Asians as like, oh, but see, there's no racism against Asians because Asians are being successful in this way, until they don't, and they need a scapegoat. And so I think there's kind of two sides, and Asian Americans are often caught in the middle and not wanting to lose. And the thing is, this is again showing the diversity of Asian Americans, because while the media portrays Asian Americans as the ones being hurt by affirmative action, actually most Asian Americans are in support of affirmative action, and actually, but they're being used as this kind of picture, right, to say like, no, affirmative action hurts minorities, when there's a very selective group of Asian Americans that are advocating for affirmative action, actually against the majority of Asian Americans who support affirmative action. So yes, I think that's what I wanted to add.
For classroom teachers that are trying to absorb and soak in all that you've shared with them, but feel like okay, what should my next step be? Where should I go from here? What would you recommend?
I think it depends on what age I mean, at the minimal, I would love to just to see more Asian American books. I remember several years ago, my son came home and he's like, hey, so-and-so's mom is going to come in and read this book on Mae Jemison and like Black History Month. And he's like, can you come read a book? And I was like racking my brain to come up with like a famous Asian American picture book bio. And there were like not very many at the time. There was one about Maya Lin, but it wasn't like very like second grade friendly. It's got I mean, it's a beautiful book, but it's kind of text heavy. It's not great for a read aloud. And so now I feel like there are so many options. And so sometimes I'm like, if you're just starting, because I feel like sometimes when you come to things like that, you're like, so many resources, so many ideas, and it just is too much, right? So like one thing you can start with is like pick a book or pick a story or pick a poem and start with that and build from there, right? This is like the long game. And you might realize like the kids are excited and, you know, and like look for opportunities. And so I think at like the low bar where to start with, but if you're also looking to build an entire unit, there's longer books you can use. There's tons, you know, like I shared, the Orange Story has tons of resources already built in. There's places where you can find entire lessons. But always make sure you customize too, right? And because I've had a lot of conversations recently with some educators about like our base desire is to have someone hand us something that we can do, right? Because that's the easiest. But what happens then is because we're not doing the work to like really figure out what that means in that context, is that sometimes we can do more harm as educators in trying to do stuff that's right. Because we haven't done like the harder work of like learning that stuff inside. So even as a quick example, my district has like a big anti-racist curriculum, which is phenomenal. There's a lot of talk about intersectionality, all of that. But I heard from some students or from some parents in the community on the first day of school, some kids were asked to like divulge like their names and their pronouns. Now, sixth graders, a lot of them are not ready to talk about their pronouns, right? Or even ready to divulge their pronouns if they're not going with like their if they're not cisgendered, et cetera. And so like that was a good intention, right? Wanting to recognize kids who might be trans or non-binary and give them the opportunity to, you know, share their pronouns. But to throw kids right into that on the first day of middle school, like you got to see that's not going to work well, right? So like there's that teacher know-how too, of like thinking about how is this going to work? How do I really thoughtfully create opportunities for learning around this? And so there are tons of lessons and resources online, but really take the time to get to know them and to know your students and like really think about how it makes sense to do it within the context of your classroom.
Yeah, and I think that just goes back to the idea of humanizing practices, right? Is that we have to know who our students are and know who we are. And I think, you know, in terms of a first step, I also think if you're not ready to jump into the curriculum because you know you need to do the self-work to get more knowledge and understanding, even enhancing a classroom library, right? Every classroom can have a classroom library, and we've provided a ton of titles. And in that way, you're showing that diverse folks, that Asian Americans, that Pacific Islanders actually have a place on your classroom bookshelves, and you're not really forcing anybody to go there, right? But there's these opportunities because representation really does matter, right? When I was a middle school English teacher, I really made sure that my classroom library had representation that reflected the students in my classroom. So if I had a lot of Pacific Islander, Latinx, African American, Asian American students. And so I really wanted to make sure, and like Jung said, you know, I haven't been in a middle school classroom in about 10 years. But 10 years ago, there was just not a lot. Like I had to really, really search to find titles. And it was just like anything that I could find with representation. Now there's not only representation, but there's affirming representation. And so having kids, you know, have access to those books, I think is a really, really nice start as we as educators are then doing the work to little by little revise our curriculum. Because I know that educators have a lot on their plate and you have a lot of really great, you know, things that you want to do, but then we're like 2 or 3 weeks out from the start of the school year or a week out. And it's like, how do I revamp my curriculum right now? So maybe just getting those books on shelves first and then doing some work to do little by little implementation.
Thank you. Other questions? And do feel free to just unmute.
This isn't a question, but thank you for everything you've been saying. One of the things that I did in my 7th grade ELA class several years ago with my student teacher was to start with a moment of joy, highlighting someone every single day. And at the time, I started it because I'd gone to a different conference where someone's like, I don't have time to include women in history in my curriculum. I'm like, oh my gosh, how can we not have time? So 5 minutes at the beginning of every day, we just look at someone, which has morphed into the kids then also, using people that inspire them. They create their own to share with their classmates. But we've been doing for the past couple of years following the Heritage Months, and which has led to finding awesome people. But this year, we're just going to intersperse people all year. Mention the Heritage Months, but not, you just don't need 1 month. But it has been a tremendous learning curve for me to look at the specifically within the, and I've used the term AAPI, so I feel very challenged about that today, but what that means. Like it's huge, and all the difference. And so as we've been looking at like athletes and actors and activists that inspire us, we have just learned a lot as a community. And then it's led to kids wanting to go read more books about different communities. It's led to some research in the classroom, some project-based learning. So I do think having a balance between coming up with some ideas, but leaving it open for kids, but learning about people. And we really try to focus on, when you said like current moments, I try to look for young people that look like them or that are their age. But it's also the one other thing led to some great conversations as we've talked about identity in the classroom, kids asking each other, finding respectful ways to learn more about people. Because at my school, kids just always assume if they're Asian American, they're Japanese American. And so that came up in class and we talked about it. And most of my students are actually Filipino American or Vietnamese American. And the students were blown away to learn about this. And so it's opened up some great conversations, navigating this with 7th graders, finding respectful ways to say this, but that's been teachable too. But I thank you very much for this because it's given me a lot of great ideas, and I feel affirmed about mixing all the people up throughout the year, because at first I was a little bit hesitant to let go of but I like the monthly spotlight because we really can concentrate. But anyhow, I'm trying not to marginalize to 1 month. So you get more than May. So
No, I love that, Susie. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that's a really excellent example, right? I think when we have kind of this interspersing and we have these opportunities for students to learn about their colleagues, I mean, that is what anti-bias, anti-racist education is, right? It's about knowing your own identity, learning about others' identity, and then working towards justice and activism through having those examples. And so I think it's really lovely that you're already doing this. And I just want to say that I think at one point, Jung and I were writing something a few years ago, and we put AAPI also. And then they were like, are you talking about PIs though? Or are you just talking about Asian Americans? So we've been called on that too. And I think it's part of the humility of ongoing learning, right? Because I think our goal is in using AAPI to use that as a socio-political term, but then we also want to make sure that we're not just using a term in a way that appropriates and covers or erases experiences. And so I just want to say in a very humanizing way, we do that. We have done that too. And it's part of our evolution as well. And so thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you. Thank you, Susie. And thank you for Bettina for that response. We have some books to give away. And I'd love to have Bettina and Jung engage in deciding who's going to get these books. So I'm wondering if we could do it. Don't tell anybody when your birthdays are, and I hope they can't look it up online. How about if we put just the month and day of your birthday, no years, okay? And put it in, if you'd like to participate in the book giveaway, put that into the chat, and I'll let Bettina and Jung find someone who is close to their birthdays to give the books to. I see some going in.
This is a fun way to do a giveaway.
let's see. Oh, a few more coming in. All right, has everybody had a chance to put their birthdays in? Okay, all right. Jung, Bettina, who've we got for books?
Bev Johns is the closest. I'm assuming it's Beverly or maybe it's Bev. It's closest to my birthday.
All right, Bev, we're sending a
then-
book your way.
And then I am sorry because Jung just talked about names and I don't know how to pronounce your name, but Jamaica, will you tell me if that's wrong? Will you correct me, please? Foster, your birthday is 2 days away from mine, so yours is the closest. And I'm so sorry if I got your name wrong. Please correct me so that I know how to pronounce it.
You said it perfect.
Oh, I'm so happy you won. Congratulations.
Congratulations. And, you know, really, this was such a wonderful session. Thank you so much. I feel like it's congratulations to all of us that you've given us such a wonderful gift of resources today, sharing your expertise and your time with us, and so gracious in those gifts. Thank you very, very much. The evaluation link is in the chat, so please be sure to give us feedback. We'd like that from everybody, but especially if you are seeking PD, be sure you fill that out so that we can give that to you. To Dr. Shea and Dr. Kim, thank you so very, very much. We are honored.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We had a great time.
And on that note of thanks, we will be back at 2 o'clock to begin our next session, where we've got an extraordinary panel with Susie Hutton, Anusha Nadkarni, Addie Weaver, Hex Ram, and it's going to be facilitated by Professor Jennifer Kreider from Illinois Wesleyan University. So please hurry back at 2 o'clock to join us for LGBTQ+, how to be advocates and allies with and for students. And again, Dr. Kim and Dr. Shea, thank you so very much.
Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.